The hallway encounter. The 22nd floor of Hartman Global was a quiet sea of cubicles at night. The usual buzz of phones and clatter of keyboards replaced by the steady hum of air conditioning and the faint glow of monitors left running. Elena Morales sat at her desk with her shoulders slightly hunched, her glasses slipping down her nose as she typed the final lines of a proposal due the next morning. The office was deserted. Most of her colleagues had left hours ago, rushing off to their families, their dinners, their evening escapes from corporate life. But Elena had grown used to staying late. For her, the silence of an empty office wasn't a burden, it was a sanctuary. Without distractions, without chatter and interruptions, she could finally hear her own thoughts clearly. She adjusted the stack of notes she had carefully highlighted, each line color-coded, each page marked with sticky tabs. This wasn't just a report, it was her chance to prove herself. And for Elena, proving herself had always been about more than impressing a boss. It was about justifying the sacrifices of her grandmother who had raised her, about making the long bus rides and the late nights worth it, about showing herself that she belonged in a world that often told her she didn't. Her pen scratched against the paper as she cross-checked numbers one last time. A soft sigh escaped her lips, and without realizing it, she began to hum quietly. It was an old lullaby her grandmother had sung when Elena was a child, a melody tied to comfort and resilience. The sound filled the air, gentle and unassuming, floating between the cubicles like a small thread of warmth in an otherwise sterile place. Elena never sang around others. Her voice was something private, something she thought didn't belong in the polished world of business suits and boardrooms. But alone at this hour she allowed herself that comfort. Her voice was soft, imperfect but sincere. And in that sincerity there was something rare. Unbeknownst to Elena, someone else was still in the building that night. Daniel Hartman, the CEO whose name was carved into the very identity of the company, had returned to his office after an evening dinner meeting to retrieve a forgotten folder of documents. His life was an endless carousel of responsibilities, meetings, negotiations, investor calls, and though he carried the weight of success easily in public, the quiet truth was that he felt increasingly disconnected from the very people he led. He had grown accustomed to polished smiles, empty compliments, and carefully crafted pitches. Yet as he paused in his office, he heard something unusual. A voice, not a corporate pitch, not the rehearsed tone of an employee seeking approval, but singing. Real, unguarded, unpolished singing, carrying faintly through the vents. Daniel set the folder down and stilled himself, listening. The melody was simple, almost fragile, but it tugged at something in him he hadn't felt in years. It reminded him of childhood evenings when his mother hummed old folk songs while tidying up their modest home. Before success, before responsibility, before his life had been defined by numbers and headlines. He found himself stepping toward the door, curiosity guiding him more strongly than any business obligation. Most CEOs would have dismissed it as unprofessional, perhaps even irritating, but Daniel felt the opposite. He felt pulled by it, as if authenticity itself had managed to seep through the concrete walls of his own guarded world. He rode the elevator down 3 floors, the quiet hum of machinery echoing his own anticipation. The doors opened onto the dimly lit corridor of the marketing department, where only every third light flickered on to save energy during the night shift. The atmosphere was different from the polished gleam of the executive floor. Here the walls were lined with colorful campaign posters, and scattered papers covered desks left mid-task. Daniel walked with measured steps, guided by the faint melody that grew clearer with every stride. Meanwhile, Elena had finally finished her report. She leaned back in her chair, stretching her arms above her head, feeling the tension in her muscles release. She saved the file with a satisfied click and shut her laptop. A short break, she thought, just enough to fetch some water before returning to polish the formatting. She smoothed down her modest navy dress, pushed her glasses higher, and walked down the corridor, still humming faintly. To her, the tune was just a comfort, a background rhythm that reminded her she wasn't entirely alone. She didn't know that her humming had already drawn the attention of someone who was rarely moved by anything outside the logic of business. As she rounded the corner near the elevator lobby, Elena nearly collided with a tall figure. She stopped abruptly, startled. "Oh, excuse me," she said quickly, her natural courtesy surfacing immediately. The man before her was sharply dressed despite the late hour, his tailored suit still crisp, his presence commanding in a way that made her pulse quicken. His hair was slightly tousled, as if he'd been working late himself, and his eyes carried an intensity she hadn't often seen in strangers. Without recognizing who he was, Elena did what she had always been taught, to meet people with respect. She offered a polite, sincere smile and stepped aside to give him room. Daniel, in turn, found himself unexpectedly disarmed. Here she was, the voice he had followed, standing with humility and authenticity, offering him courtesy as if he were simply another worker crossing paths in the quiet hours of the night. There was no recognition in her eyes, no guarded performance. For the first time in a long time, someone looked at him as a man, not a title. "It's all right," Daniel replied, his tone softer than his usual commanding voice in meetings. "Working late?" "Yes," Elena admitted, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I just finished a report for tomorrow's deadline. The quiet hours help me focus." Her words were simple, but her sincerity was undeniable. Daniel nodded slowly, feeling a strange comfort in the honesty of her response. "I understand," he said. "There's something about an empty building at night. It feels different, more honest somehow." Elena blinked in surprise. Most executives she had ever met were too hurried, too distracted to notice such things. She tilted her head slightly, curiosity rising. "Exactly," she said, her smile growing. "It's peaceful, almost like the walls themselves relax when no one else is here." Then, almost sheepishly, she added, "I hope my humming wasn't too loud. Sometimes I forget I'm not alone." Daniel's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "On the contrary," he said warmly, "it was refreshing. Don't apologize for bringing a little humanity into these halls." His compliment carried no pretense, only genuine appreciation. Elena flushed lightly at the unexpected kindness. She wasn't used to receiving such words from strangers, especially not from men in expensive suits who usually seemed far removed from her world. She gave a small nod, suddenly aware that she didn't even know his name. "Well, I should get back to work," she said politely. "It was nice meeting you." Daniel hesitated for only a second, then decided to hold back his full identity. Tonight, in this rare encounter, he wanted to be just a man, not a CEO, not a leader under constant scrutiny. "Daniel," he said simply. "Elena," she replied with a smile that lit up her otherwise tired face. "Have a good evening, Daniel." "You too, Elena," he said softly. "And thank you for the music." As the elevator doors closed behind him, Elena lingered in the hallway for a moment, puzzled by the unusual warmth of the meeting. She had no idea that the man she'd greeted out of courtesy, the one she thought was just another late-night worker, was in fact the man whose decisions shaped the entire company she worked for. Nor did she realize how much her sincerity had already unsettled and inspired him. For Daniel, as he returned to his penthouse that night, the encounter lingered in his thoughts like a melody he couldn't shake. In a world of polished surfaces and rehearsed performances, one woman's simple courtesy and unguarded voice had reached him more deeply than anything else in years. And though he couldn't yet explain why, he knew this was not the last time he wanted to hear her voice. That completes Part 1, The Hallway Encounter. The trials of trust, the weeks that followed the quarterly meeting unfolded like a test of endurance for Elena. Though the moment in which Daniel Hartman had called upon her and recognized her analysis had felt like a breakthrough, it also came with consequences she had not fully anticipated. Some colleagues congratulated her, offering quiet words of support in passing, but others looked at her differently. There was a new weight in the glances she received, a silent calculation in the eyes of those who now saw her not just as the quiet junior associate, but as someone who had caught the CEO's attention. Cassandra, in particular, seemed unable to hide her resentment. She began to treat Elena with a sharper edge, disguising her disdain under the mask of professionalism, but her every word carried an undertone that suggested Elena had overstepped her place. Despite the atmosphere around her, Elena focused on her work. She had always believed that results spoke louder than gossip, and so she doubled down, staying late, refining her reports, and bringing a level of thoroughness that even her managers could not ignore. Yet behind her discipline lay another truth. Her life outside the office was quietly unraveling. Her grandmother, the woman who had raised her after her parents passed, had fallen ill. It wasn't sudden, but the gradual decline had reached a point where Elena found herself torn between responsibilities. The evenings she once devoted solely to work were now split between hospital visits and tending to her grandmother's needs. She slept less, ate hastily, and carried the invisible weight of worry with her everywhere. It was on one of those weary evenings that Daniel noticed her again. He had returned to the office after a long board meeting, the kind that drained even his patience, and he saw her light still on. Through the glass wall of her department, he watched as she leaned over her desk, one hand propping up her head, the other scribbling notes with quiet determination. Something about her posture told him more than any report could. He could see the fatigue she carried, yet also the persistence that kept her there. For reasons he could not entirely explain, he found himself walking toward her instead of heading straight to his car. "Elena," he said gently, his voice breaking the quiet hum of the empty floor. She looked up quickly, startled, then straightened in her chair. "Mr. Hartman," she said, her tone respectful, though her eyes betrayed the exhaustion she tried to hide. "You're here late again," Daniel observed, not as a criticism, but as a recognition. He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Are you managing all right?" For a moment, Elena hesitated. It wasn't in her nature to admit vulnerability, especially not to someone like him. But the sincerity in his voice was disarming. She lowered her eyes briefly, then said softly, "It's been a little difficult lately. My grandmother's health has been declining, and I've been trying to balance everything." She almost regretted the words as soon as they left her lips, fearing she had revealed too much. Daniel's expression softened in a way she hadn't expected. In the world he inhabited, where people often pretended strength even when they were breaking, such honesty was rare. "Family should never feel like a burden," he said quietly. "It is what grounds us, what keeps us human." He paused, then added with a thoughtful tone, "You've been carrying this weight alone, haven't you?" Elena gave a small, tired smile. "I suppose I have, but it's nothing I can't handle." Something about her resilience struck Daniel deeply. He had known countless employees who collapsed under pressure, yet here was someone who bore far more than her share without complaint. He wanted to offer help, but he also knew that true support meant respecting the pride with which she carried herself. Instead, he said, "If you ever need flexibility or if your work requires adjustment to accommodate what you're going through, speak to me directly. Don't let the fear of appearing weak keep you from what matters most." Elena looked at him, truly looked. And in that moment she saw not just the CEO but the man who had once listened to her, humming in the quiet of a hallway. There was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding. "Thank you, Mr. Hartman," she said sincerely. "That means more than I can say." From that evening onward, a subtle shift occurred. Daniel began to check in on her progress more often, not in a way that drew suspicion, but in moments that felt natural, as though he simply wanted to understand her perspective. He asked questions others overlooked, listened intently when she spoke, and offered insights that revealed not only his sharp business mind, but also a rare capacity for empathy. Slowly, a foundation of trust began to form between them, one that went beyond titles and roles. But the road was not without obstacles. Cassandra, noticing the subtle attention Daniel gave Elena, allowed her jealousy to harden into quiet sabotage. She began to question Elena's contributions in team meetings, sometimes taking credit for ideas that weren't hers, other times casting doubt on Elena's reliability given her personal situation. The whispers spread quickly, rumors that Elena was gaining favor not because of her work, but because of some imagined connection to the CEO. Elena heard fragments of these conversations in passing, each one a small sting that threatened to undo her confidence. One afternoon, during a critical strategy session, Cassandra directly challenged Elena's proposal, dismissing her data as unproven assumptions in front of the entire team. Elena felt the heat rise in her chest, the familiar tightening of fear that she might not belong here after all. But then she remembered Daniel's words, that she should not let fear strip away what mattered. Steeling herself, she calmly defended her position, presenting evidence and reasoning with clarity that silenced the room. For a moment, even Cassandra had no retort. Daniel, who had been observing quietly from his seat at the end of the table, allowed the silence to linger before speaking. "What I see here," he said evenly, "is not unproven assumption but thoughtful analysis backed by careful preparation. And I expect every member of this team to recognize that." His eyes swept the room, resting briefly on Cassandra before moving on. The message was clear. That day, Elena walked out of the conference room with a steadier heart. She had faced the storm and held her ground. She knew the whispers would not end overnight, but she also knew something more important, that her voice had been heard, her integrity seen. And though the trials ahead would surely test her further, the seed of trust planted between her and Daniel was beginning to grow, shaping a path neither of them had anticipated when they first met in that quiet hallway. Rising storms. The weeks after the tense strategy session brought a strange duality into Elena's world. On one hand, her confidence had begun to solidify, fueled by the knowledge that her analysis had stood firm under scrutiny, and that the CEO himself had defended her work. For the first time since she joined the company, she felt her efforts had meaning beyond the quiet corners where she used to sit unnoticed. Yet on the other hand, a darker current stirred beneath the surface of her department. Cassandra's quiet resentment had grown into an active storm, and her influence spread in whispers, rumors, and subtle manipulations that were harder to fight than direct confrontation. Elena began to notice small changes. Files that she had carefully prepared went missing just before meetings, forcing her to scramble to recover data. Emails she sent to collaborators seemed to disappear until deadlines loomed, making it look as though she was disorganized. Colleagues who once smiled at her in the hallway now avoided her gaze, fearful of being associated with her while Cassandra's shadow loomed. It was not sabotage that could be easily proven, but it was enough to sow doubt and frustration, enough to make Elena question if her rising place in the company was built on a fragile, shaky ground. At the same time, her personal life weighed on her shoulders with unrelenting pressure. Her grandmother's health had taken a sharp decline, requiring more hospital visits, more late nights, more moments where Elena found herself torn between work deadlines and sitting at her grandmother's bedside. The once lively woman who had raised her with warmth and laughter now lay fragile and pale, her voice a whisper, her hand cold in Elena's grasp. And though Elena carried herself with dignity at the office, more than once she cried silently in the solitude of her small apartment, knowing she could not be everywhere at once. One evening, when the pressure had nearly broken her, she received an unexpected call from Daniel. He rarely reached out outside of professional matters, and the sound of his voice surprised her. "Elena," he said, "I noticed you haven't submitted the final revisions on the market report. Is everything all right?" Her instinct was to apologize, to bury her struggles beneath a veneer of responsibility. But something in his tone stopped her. It wasn't the clipped voice of a CEO chasing deadlines. It was the steady, concerned tone of a man who had begun to care about the person behind the reports. With a sigh, Elena admitted, "I'm doing my best, Mr. Hartman, but my grandmother, she doesn't have much time left. It's been difficult." Her voice cracked despite her efforts to stay composed. There was a long silence on the line. Then Daniel spoke softly. "I'm sorry, Elena. Truly. I know what it's like to lose someone who feels like the center of your world. When I lost my father, I thought I had to hide my grief, to bury myself in work until I forgot. But grief doesn't fade because we hide it. It only turns into something heavier. Don't make the mistake I made. Be with her while you can. Work can wait." Tears filled Elena's eyes at his unexpected vulnerability. She had always seen him as untouchable, a figure of wealth and power, but in that moment he revealed a wound of his own. It reminded her that even those who seemed the strongest carried pain beneath their armor. She whispered, "Thank you. I didn't think anyone would understand." From that moment on, Daniel made subtle adjustments that only she seemed to notice. Meetings were rescheduled at times that allowed her space to care for her grandmother. Deadlines that once seemed immovable were quietly extended. He never announced these changes, never drew attention to them, but Elena recognized the silent hand of support guiding her path. It was not favoritism. It was compassion, a recognition of her humanity in a world that often demanded employees to be machines. Yet as Daniel's quiet support grew, so too did Cassandra's fury. To her, these small mercies looked like favoritism, and in her bitterness she saw an opportunity. She began feeding rumors to the higher executives that Elena was receiving special treatment, that her rise was not earned but gifted, that her connection with the CEO was inappropriate. The whispers spread quickly, twisting into ugly speculation that stained Elena's reputation, and though Elena tried to keep her head high, she could feel the weight of suspicion following her everywhere she went. The storm reached its peak when Cassandra arranged for Elena's absence at a critical investor presentation. Knowing Elena was at the hospital with her grandmother, Cassandra took control of the meeting, claiming Elena had failed to deliver her analysis on time. By the time Elena arrived the next day, exhausted from a sleepless night at her grandmother's bedside, she was met with cold stares and veiled questions about her priorities. The betrayal stung, but what hurt most was the thought that her grandmother's final days might be overshadowed by the collapse of everything she had worked so hard for. For a brief, crushing moment, Elena wondered if Cassandra was right, if she was foolish to think she could balance both worlds, foolish to believe that integrity and persistence could outlast cruelty. But when she stepped into her office, she found Daniel waiting. He had already heard the distorted version of events, but he did not speak immediately. Instead, he studied her face, the grief in her eyes, the fatigue in her posture. Then in a calm but commanding voice, he said, "Tell me what happened. All of it." Elena told him everything about the hospital visits, about the missing files, about Cassandra's quiet sabotage, about the presentation she had been unable to attend because she chose to hold her grandmother's hand through the night. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, something stronger rose within her, the truth clear and undeniable. Daniel listened without interruption, and when she finished, his jaw tightened. "Elena," he said firmly, "no one should ever make you feel guilty for choosing family over work. And no one will destroy what you have built here with lies." In that moment, Elena realized something profound. She was not alone in this storm. She had someone powerful enough to shield her, but more importantly, someone willing to stand beside her. Not because of ambition, not because of appearances, but because he believed in her. And though the battles ahead would be fierce, she felt a spark of strength ignite within her, ready to face whatever storm Cassandra would bring. The breaking point. The storm that had been building for weeks finally erupted in a way no one at Sterling Enterprises could ignore. The tension in the air was palpable as the annual board meeting approached, a day where the entire company's future would be decided, where major projects were reviewed, and where reputations were either cemented or destroyed. For Elena, it was the moment where everything Cassandra had been plotting against her came to a head. She knew Cassandra would stop at nothing to undermine her, and the rumors that had been quietly whispered in the hallways were about to be thrust into the spotlight. On the morning of the meeting, Elena woke before dawn. She sat quietly by her grandmother's bedside, holding the frail woman's hand. The hospital room was filled with the soft hum of machines, the faint scent of antiseptic, and the heavy silence of approaching farewell. Her grandmother's voice, though weak, still carried the warmth that had sustained Elena through every hardship. "My sweet girl," she whispered, "don't let them take your light. You were born to stand tall even when the world tries to bend you." Tears streamed down Elena's face, but she forced herself to smile. "I'll make you proud, Grandma. I promise." When she finally walked into Sterling's glass tower hours later, her heart was heavy with grief but fortified with purpose. She wore a simple navy dress, nothing flashy but professional and strong. Every step down the polished marble hallway felt like walking into a battlefield. Colleagues glanced at her with curiosity, some with sympathy, others with doubt, but she held her head high. She could not afford to falter now. The boardroom was vast, lined with windows that overlooked the city skyline, sunlight pouring in like a spotlight on the players about to take their stage. At the long mahogany table sat the senior executives, investors, and board members, each with sharp eyes and sharper questions. Daniel occupied the head of the table, his expression calm but unreadable. Cassandra sat 2 seats down, her perfectly tailored suit and practiced smile giving her the aura of confidence, but her eyes glittered with cold ambition. As presentations began, Cassandra seized every opportunity to cast doubt on Elena. When Elena presented her market analysis, Cassandra interrupted with cutting remarks, twisting numbers and sowing seeds of uncertainty. "Are we sure these figures are accurate?" she asked sweetly, feigning concern. "We wouldn't want another oversight," the board murmured, some leaning forward with interest, others frowning. Elena felt her chest tighten, but she remembered her grandmother's words. She steadied her breath, adjusted her glasses, and met Cassandra's gaze with quiet defiance. "Every figure has been triple-checked," she replied firmly. "And if there is doubt, I welcome any independent audit. The data will hold." Her voice was calm, unshaken, and for the first time, Cassandra blinked in surprise at her resolve. But Cassandra was not finished. She shifted her strategy. leaning into the rumors she had carefully spread. "Of course," she said with a sly smile. "We should also consider the optics of relying so heavily on someone who, while talented, seems to have unique access to the CEO. It would be irresponsible not to question whether decisions are being influenced by personal connections rather than merit." The room fell silent. The implication hung in the air like a poisonous fog. Elena felt her face flush, humiliation burning through her veins. But before she could respond, Daniel rose from his seat. His voice was sharp, commanding, and filled with an authority that silenced the room. "Enough." He looked directly at Cassandra, his eyes cold steel. "Let me make something very clear. Every advancement Elena has made in this company is because of her talent, her dedication, and her integrity. She has earned her place here, not through favoritism but through results that speak for themselves. Anyone who suggests otherwise insults not only her but this entire organization." Cassandra's confident smile faltered, but Daniel was not done. He turned to the board. "If you doubt her work, examine it yourselves. If you question her merit, compare her results against anyone else in this room. I stand by her not because she needs my defense but because truth demands it." The silence that followed was electric. For the first time, Elena felt the weight of his unwavering support, not whispered in private but declared openly in the heart of power. It was a shield she had not asked for, but one she desperately needed. The board members exchanged glances, and slowly the tide began to shift. Questions about her reports became less accusatory and more curious. Investors nodded as Elena explained her strategies with clarity and confidence. Even those who had doubted her began to see the strength beneath her calm exterior. By the time her presentation concluded, the room buzzed not with suspicion but with respect. Cassandra, however, refused to accept defeat quietly. In a desperate attempt, she produced a series of manipulated documents, claiming they showed errors in Elena's reports. But Daniel had anticipated her move. He gestured for the IT director to bring up the system logs, which revealed that Cassandra herself had tampered with files. Gasps echoed through the boardroom as the truth came to light. Cassandra's mask of composure shattered, her face paling as she realized her scheme had been exposed. In the end, the board voted unanimously to approve Elena's strategy, hailing it as a bold and innovative path forward. Cassandra was escorted out of the room, her career in ruins, her whispers silenced at last. As the meeting adjourned, Elena remained seated, overwhelmed by the weight of what had just happened. She had faced humiliation, betrayal, and the threat of losing everything, but she had stood her ground. She had survived the storm not by being perfect, but by being true to herself. Daniel approached her quietly, his voice softer now, stripped of the commanding tone he had used moments earlier. "You didn't need me to defend you," he said. "You stood taller than anyone else in that room. I only reminded them of what was already true." Tears welled in Elena's eyes, but this time they were not born of grief or humiliation. They were born of relief, of gratitude, of the realization that she had found not only her place but her strength. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in me when I almost stopped believing in myself." That evening, Elena returned to the hospital to find her grandmother resting peacefully. Though weak, her grandmother opened her eyes and smiled faintly as Elena shared the news. "I told you," she whispered, her voice fragile but filled with pride. "You were born to stand tall." Those were some of the last words her grandmother would ever speak, but they stayed with Elena forever. They became the anchor that carried her through the years ahead, a constant reminder that no storm could extinguish her light. In time, Elena rose to become one of the youngest executives in Sterling Enterprises. Her journey was not easy, but it was honest, built on resilience, compassion, and integrity. And though the world around her often tried to bend her, she never allowed it to break her. For Daniel, the woman he had first noticed humming in a quiet hallway became more than an employee. She became proof that leadership is not about authority, but about lifting others to see their own strength. He often reflected that in a world obsessed with power, it was Elena's humility and quiet determination that had transformed the company, and him forever. And so, from a simple greeting in a dimly lit hallway, a story of courage, love, and transformation was written, a story that reminded everyone who heard it that no act of kindness, no moment of resilience, and no flicker of light in the darkness is ever wasted.